Hi, everybody. The book I'm going to read from to you this evening is The Raven's Tale. It's a story that I think in some ways is an adult fairy tale. It has a lot of magical realism in it. And when I was working on it, one of the things that was great fun for me was doing tons of research about stars. I just had become fascinated with everything about stars. So there's a lot of star imagery in the book. And I think in some ways it's a book about being lost and then being found. And while I was working on it, Angela Jordan, who is a friend of mine, was the person who, when I would say, I think this book just doesn't make sense, I don't really think I can keep doing it, she would say, oh no, you need to keep writing this book. So the book is dedicated to her. And the other person the book is dedicated to is my husband, Jeffrey. And in the front it says, Jeffrey Spence, who taught me if you make a choice that isn't working, make a different choice. He said that to me probably 35 years ago. And it was a turning point in my life because whenever I'm not too happy about something, I remember that. And another person I want to thank is Tammy Podofalski, who has been just amazing on all three books in this trilogy with manuscript preparation and putting up with me in all sorts of ways. And she's here too, so thank you, Tammy. So the book is divided into 4 parts, and they are based on 4 axioms about sacred place. And I borrowed those ideas from a philosopher named Belden Lane. And so I'm going to read from part 1 tonight, and another part a little bit later. I think it's part 2 or 3. And the axiom that governs the first part of the book is sacred place is not chosen, it chooses. Sightings. God did not say, you will not be troubled, you will not be tempted, you will not be distressed. But God said, you will not be overcome. Julian of Norwich. Entire worlds arrive and depart with each laugh and each sigh, each birth and each death. Morning glories hold themselves open from dawn until they close at noon. Cicadas chirp and click in cedar trees. Dogs lie tired in the August heat. In this world, all possible outcomes happen, and they inhabit their own universe. We see only one road, but we travel them all. Time wavers, cascades, implodes and explodes, while some of us check our watches, mark our calendars, and work to erase the wrinkles on our faces, wanting to control time. People and places come and go in the external world, while we keep what we love and fear in our hearts. The mossy scent of mushrooms in a rock garden filled with blooming iris smells sweet. The memory of a first kiss under the full moon makes our blood rush, roar, and crash on our rocky hearts. A knife meant for cutting meat is used instead to cut a throat, silencing a scream and turning the survivor's dreams into night terrors. As cartographers of the heart, we live inside and outside time, charting visible and invisible landscapes. We are caught in the clockworks of our own making, swinging from a starry pendulum. Rocks contain silent histories and futures. Rocks and waves and trembling sea creatures quake with knowledge humans try to handle. Human knowledge shifts and expands in lingering appearances and emptiness. Wisdom arrives like a spy, ushered in by a sultry wind or camouflaged by fog. Everything is composed of atoms. Atoms are composed of protons, neurons, and electrons. The protons and neutrons huddle in the center of each atom in the nucleus, and the electrons whiz around the outside so quickly they blur. But all atoms are not the same. What makes one atom different from another is the number of its protons, neutrons, and electrons. Hydrogen is unique. It is the simplest atom with only 1 proton and 1 electron. In the human body, hydrogen performs like a top, where it spins left, right, up, down, and sideways. Placed in the magnetic field, hydrogen atoms line up, half move toward the head and half move toward the feet. Medical technicians, nurses, and doctors witness this phenomenon daily. In the universe, fusion is the process that powers the sun and stars. When two atoms of hydrogen combine, they form an atom of helium, and it is during this process that the energy created makes all life on Earth possible. The sun fuses 620 tons of hydrogen every second of the day and night. Remember that sunlight is nearly 9 minutes old when it touches us. And although all of the daylight that warms us, the dawn into which we dream, and the sunset we share with the world started on its journey a very long time ago, these atoms do form our universe, earth, air, fire, and water. And we're as much a part of the ancient streets of Bruges as the salt of any mother's tear, and as much a part of the blood pounding in the heart of a Beatuck woman watching for the first time as a Viking longboat arrives on her island in the North Atlantic. Atoms were on board the ship that carried the plague to Bruges and broke a mother's heart. The number of hydrogen atoms in the universe is a relatively finite number, 4 followed by 79 zeros. The sound of infinity, one droning, sustained E-flat major chord. Life forming and transforming into story after story. This is the story of atoms dancing over time. The haunting and healing of Minette LaCroix, a woman who lost her son, drank herself into oblivion, went into rehab and left, fleeing to her grandfather's abandoned cottage on an island. She found a dog, met an angel, traveled back in time and rescued the angel's son. She fell in love with an accused man and traveled the island's interior, looking for signs. She found bones, feathers, and emptiness while relocating herself. All the while, she was observed by the storytelling raven, Hugin Munin, who flew between worlds and across time. Each sacred landscape chose the woman and the bird. The raven spoke words better than many humans, infinitely great and infinitely small. The words made a tapestry, weaving worlds together. Across cultures, one can find time-honored images of talking ravens and three-legged crows, singled out as symbols of intelligence and wisdom. Frequently painted red, woven into the robes of the powerful, illuminating ancient manuscripts, scratched on cave walls or painted on humble earthenware dishes. These birds remain with us, their futures guaranteed by the telling and retelling of their tales. Hugin Munin was a cousin to these ancient, articulate birds, wily and wise. In his immortality, he learned to speak. He watched the world and the people in it by peeks and glances, stares and observations, furtively and full on. He vocalized. He told stories. He solved puzzles. He slipped through the past to the present, and now he was ready to create the future. So that's the opening. And I'm going to read a couple little snippets through it and then stop. So Minette, the main female character, is running away from her life. And the man that she falls in love with quite a bit later in the book is also running away from his life. And the raven who's talking to you in the book is running away from his past. So we have 3 runaways. And they eventually come together and change. There's our plot summary. Okay, so the next chapter is called Birds of a Feather. And each of these chapters has a phrase from a poem or from a novel or from a philosopher, because if I had my wish, I think I would get to talk to all these people all the time. But since I can't, I just quote them. which works. So the quote at the beginning of this is, "Shadow warns shadow that you approach. Light warns light." And it's by Julia Hartwig. I love her poetry. Ravens don't wear watches. Time is not measured by irritating tick-tocks or marked off with X's on calendar squares. Time, as experienced by a raven, is an open window, omnipresent as air. Ravens, this raven, like his cousin Crow, uses his imagination to have fun and solve problems. Long ago and far away, the ravens, Hugin and Munin, met on a pine bough outside a castle near a crumbling stone wall. It was during the time that Hugin and Munin served the mighty King Odin, and in his service they fell in love. It was he who named them, Hugin for thought and Munin for memory. At first they only hunted together. Then they sipped and tipped at the edge of a pond. Hugin courted Munin by fluffing and circling. He danced and dodged to win her. They worked together for 2 weeks to build a nest at the top of a very tall pine tree. Hugin loved Munin with every chamber of his great 4-chambered heart, and she loved him right back. He carried bright, shiny objects for her to weave into their nest, and together they lined it with feathers and moss. Munin laid 5 perfect pale green eggs in their new nest. She and Hugin took turns warming the eggs for 18 days until the chicks pecked open their shells. The ravens fledged, but Hugin and Munin continued to visit their old nest in the pine tree on cloudless nights, looking into vastness and into each other. It was from their perch that they first observed a woman with graying auburn hair, thrashing and wailing under a full moon. They were accustomed to humans and their strange behaviors, but this woman stood out to them because of her great sadness. On a different night, they observed a ghost boy wandering in the forest, his form as thick as fog some moments and barely visible at others. They wondered who these people were, why they suffered, and where they were going. One crisp summer evening, Munin flew off. Hugin waited and waited for her to return. When the sun rose the next day, he went in search of her and found her lying in a field, her glossy sheen dull around the gunshot wound, browned by blood. Hugin could not weep, so to express his grief, he gorged on 100 grasshoppers. His fullness was a desperate attempt to replace his emptiness. Still, not satisfied, he joined a conspiracy of ravens, tens of thousands of them. Seeking solitude in numbers worked no better than gorging on grasshoppers. Finally, Hugin, in his raging sorrow, targeted a hawk that had been raiding ravens' nests. He ripped at its eyes with his beak, breaking the tiny socket bones. Other ravens watched, impressed and disturbed by his savagery. Then Hugin left the group to be alone. He stopped jousting with ravens in the air. He became a fisher, using discarded bread he found along the way as bait. He caught fish, but he wouldn't eat them. Nothing he did or did not do resurrected Munin, so he took her name, to honor her and to sustain his heart. And from that day on, he was known as Hugin Munin, becoming both thought and memory. Hugin Munin's vision let him see the past and future, before and hereafter, then and now, heaven and hell. He had no memory of anything but life, and his best memories were of his time with his life mate Munin. After expressing his grief, Hugin Munin began to search for another companion, someone as lonely as himself. Not a mate, that was impossible. Then he remembered the auburn-haired woman and the ghost boy. Perhaps he could locate one of them. So he went in search of them. While he sought them, he fed himself on carrion. He flew and flew and flew. From afar, he watched other raven couples build their nests. They gathered twigs, strands of human hair, and thick moss, collaborating as he had with Munin to build perfect nests. Pain struck him. No more nests for him. No more green eggs, pale like a morning sky. No more bow-sitting with Moonin to watch their chicks fledge. While flying, he saw a single roan horse in a pasture, so he descended and landed on a fence post near the roan where he could watch. He entered the barn with it and sat aloft on a rafter, observing a stable boy pitch hay. The boy's work and the horse's tail gave life a momentary rhythm, but Hugin could not stay. He flew day and night, north and south, east and west, and then one day, Hugin sighted the woman he and Moonin had watched. She was boarding the ferry in Augusta, Maine. Her graying red hair flew out from her face like wings. So at this point, he begins to track her so he can connect with her. Then we're going to jump ahead 60 pages to the second part of the book. And this is the second axiom of sacred place. And that is that sacred place is ordinary place, ritually made extraordinary. And this is when you meet Jacob. And the title of the chapter is Clues, and the entry point is a piece of a Robert Frost poem. Something sinister in the town told me my secret must be known. Word I was in the house alone somehow must have gotten abroad. Word I was in my life alone. Word I had no one left but God. And I think we can all interpret however we want to what that means. Okay, so Jacob had not intended to murder anybody. It had never crossed his mind. During the flight, when the other man's hands were pressed tight against his windpipe, at the moment when Jacob felt death grabbing his throat, he used what remained of his strength to clench the letter opener in his hand and plunge it into the man's chest beneath his ribcage and up into his heart. He framed the event in the language of the board game Clue. Joel Hubbard, because that was his real name, in the accounting office with the letter opener. The game's miniature manila envelope was at the center of his life, and it held the 3 cards that convicted him. Yes, it was self-defense, and maybe with a good lawyer, Jacob could have proved his innocence, his lack of premeditation, and his need to defend himself. He might have been freed to return to his family after serving a short sentence, but the chances were just as good that he might not have been able to get off, and then he would have spent the better part of eternity in a cage. He had no proof of the second set of books, just a hunch. He could only guess at how many other partners in the accounting firm were involved up to their ears, only too glad to weigh in against him in a court of law, especially if weighing in against him saved their asses. So Jacob ran out the building, then down the street, until he reached his car, and then he drove to the nearest bank and took out all of his money. He didn't feel guilty. He knew there was plenty more in an account that only had Grace's name on it, so he knew she would be fine financially. And he knew Grace. She loved him when everything was up and up, but she was not the kind of woman who would love him when he was down and out. She was tough. She took care of herself at all costs. Her heart was hard, all corners and edges, but her soft skin and firm body had drawn him in. It was his landing zone, his hideaway. And as long as she got everything she wanted from him, he could have anything he wanted from her, except her heart. She gave no one access to that. It was how she kept herself clear and free. She took care of herself and their children the way a good kennel keeper grooms other people's dogs. But when he was inside her, he felt completely protected by her fierceness. She was, in those moments when he was inside her extraordinary world, that he was most himself. No time to be reflective, he thought. Jacob Kavanaugh, he said to himself, practicing his new name. He abandoned his car at the rental lot, hot-wired a silver Impala, and drove off. As he pulled out into the interstate, he threw his driver's license out the window. He stopped once in 9 hours to get gas, and then he ditched the stolen rental somewhere east of Lake Ontario. Next, he hitchhiked into town, waited until nightfall, and then he went to a lot near the lake. He knew fishermen often had an extra set of clothes with them in their vehicle so they could go from fishing to work. He found a Malibu with work clothes and the keys in the ignition. He jumped in and drove away. Men receded in the rearview mirror and appeared as tiny dots of light on the ice where they sat in front of their tents ice fishing. After he had traveled a safe distance, he stopped at a gas station, went to the men's room, and put on the other person's work clothes. Back in the car, he looked in the rearview mirror. He was pleased. He didn't look like Joel Hubbard, the accountant, now. His face looked scruffy with a day's growth of beard. His watch cap made him look like every man. No more tailored shirts and gray sharkskin suits for him. He had traded them in for a turtleneck, a Carhartt jacket, and flannel-lined jeans. He was going remote. His destination, the ferry to Nova Scotia, and from there to Newfoundland. No one in Canada would recognize me now. Not Grace, not my children, not my parents, not my co-workers, he thought. Joel Hubbard is dead and gone, just as surely as if the clue game cards had read the other outcome. Eldridge Smith in the accounting office with his bare hands. Jacob saw land and the figure of a woman at the same time. Women were terra firma for Jacob, his preferred landscape. From where he stood at the deck of the ferry, he could see a woman's figure on top of the highest crag. She must be watching for someone to arrive, he thought, but it isn't me. It was a rare, clear morning, and the ferry ride had given him time to reflect and let go of his despair. He had been feeding on fear like a leech on blood, until all of him felt distended but not sated. The woman who waited for the incoming boat appeared both historical and romantic. He imagined the cliff upon which she stood as a widow's walk. He thought of her as his bride, and then he remembered he was already married, and in that moment he felt the rough edge between dying and being reborn. As the ferry drew toward the port, he could see that a black dog stood by her side, and a single raven circled over her head. His heart bounced, then stopped, then pounded back to life again. Who was this woman? He thought of ravishingly beautiful fairy tale heroines accompanied by their familiars. He imagined briar roses and blackberry bushes, fortresses and towers, drawbridges and flocks of ravens circling over battlefields. Jacob disembarked. No one on the dock paid much attention to a mainlander at this time of year. They knew the reasons they came: seasonal work, cheap living, something in the past they wanted to escape.
How many titles did you consider?
I think it had 6. I think the first one was Thread, and the second one had something to do with angels. It wasn't good. And for a long time it lived with a different working title. Then it became Chronos because I thought that was funny, like time. And then I thought, no, that's a little too much of a pun. And then it turned into The Raven's Tail. Because where I was living at the time, there were all these huge crows. They weren't ravens, but they were coming in flocks and hanging out, and I was listening to them a lot. And I thought, well, they could be part of this book. Why not? You know, yeah, sure.
How did you pick the different times for time travel?
Well, a lot of this book, and this always sounds like something somebody made up, but it happens to be true. A lot of this book came to me sort of in my dreamscapes. And so Jeff's aunt had a box that she gave me that had a cameo face on it. And when you opened it, it was a 2-sided box. And if you lifted up the sides, there was handmade lace in it. So the book was once called The Lace Makers. There's another title. And I thought it was a cool box, and I didn't know what to do with it, so I put it by my bed, and that's when I began to start dreaming this book, when I got that box. So I did a ton of research on all the kinds of lace making done in Flanders and convents. And I put that aside. Then I had another idea. And so in some ways this book, a lot of my books are composites. I write them in all these little pieces. And I think, wow, we could put that together. I could make that work. And so the 1301 period with the plague and the lace-making nuns came from the box. The raven crows came from the yard. Manette is sort of a composite of a lot of pretty unhappy people I've known. Maybe a little of me in there too. You know, she's just someone who wasn't able to work some things out. So this book gave her a chance to do that.